Good night, Don Chente, for the time being. I'll have to check that out later. Thank you for sharing that, Eric, in the chat. All right. Y para ustedes que están aquí in Zoom, I'm uploading the handout one more time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is another lesson, in fact, our fourth lesson of the current Conchas y Café Bilingual Creative Writing Workshop. Tonight, I'll be the one to lead the lesson, but as usual, I am accompanied by my lovely co-host, Abraham Jaramillo, our master teaching artist. Say what's up, Abraham.
What's up?
Thank you, sir. And all of you who are joining in on Zoom, of course, you are welcome to ask any questions, make any comments using either the chat, or you can raise your hands or just come up off mute. And I'm more than happy to engage in the conversation along with you. Of course, I don't have all the answers. In fact, sometimes I have all the questions. But this will
Here
be,
we
I
are.
hope, a fun lesson for today. And for those of you joining in on Instagram Live or YouTube Live, I do have the comments feature up, so you're welcome to join in through the comments on either Instagram or YouTube. Y para empezar, well, let's take a look at our handout for today. As is our custom, I have here a quote, this time coming from Anne Bradstreet. Anne Bradstreet, para los que no conozcan, fue un poeta inglesa del Norteamérica colonial más prominente y la primera autora de las colonias norteamericanas que fue publicada. It's a pretty cool honor to have, right? To be the first writer in the New World to be published. And Anne Bradstreet is also the first Puritan figure in American literature. Como ven aquí, nació el 20 de marzo del año 1612 y falleció el 16 de septiembre 1672. Almost exactly on the Proclamation of Independence for Mexico. Now, as we see here, the quote goes, if we had no winter, the spring would not be so pleasant. If we did not sometimes taste of adversity, prosperity would not be so welcome. Y en español, como ven, dice la cita, si no tuviéramos el invierno, la primavera no sería tan agradable. Si no conociéramos la adversidad, la prosperidad no se recibiría con tanto gusto. So, what does this quote say to you? How would you interpret what it says? ¿Qué piensan? As usual, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just to get our brains working a little bit.
I
Do
think
you
for
agree? I guess would be my question for you. River?
I was gonna say I think for me, and as I say this, I don't want to take away from anybody else if they feel this quote with their heart, like this is just my opinion. This concept has always bothered me a little bit
Hmm.
because I don't believe we have to suffer to appreciate the world. I know that having suffered in various places we all have, it can give me a certain type of appreciation. But I don't believe that in order to have appreciation that is valuable or worthy, we have to suffer. I almost feel like sometimes we tell ourselves this because we want to make sense of our suffering. But I do recognize also there'll be some things that I'll say, well, I couldn't understand this in this specific way if I hadn't had this particular adversity. So I have kind of like a conflicted relationship with this quote slash idea.
Mhm. Yeah, I think most people would probably agree with that. I see, I'm assuming at least one person in our Instagram live also just said yes, in likely agreement with this quote. And then Eric in the chat on Zoom says dualities slash diversity might be healthy. So there is the potential for people to agree with this, but at the same time, this is not the only way to perceive life. There are a lot of gray areas in the world. Abraham?
Yeah, I think we all want good things to happen to us,
Yeah.
but I think it's, and I understand what River's saying is like, why do we have to suffer? But I think it's more about perception. It's like without light,
Mhm.
there cannot be darkness and vice versa. It's just a measurement, it's a gauge how we define something that's good and happy if we don't have the opposite, right? I think that's how we define what's one thing and what's the other one. We need the other one in order to see the other side of the coin or to appreciate it or to feel it. Not that we want to, right? Nobody wants that. But I do definitely like it. I think like half of the quote it was just needed. The rest was like just repeating itself.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was needed. It was just kind of self-explanatory.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a little redundant in some ways, but we are writers. Sometimes we like to go that extra mile. And then, yeah, Sarah added in the chat on Instagram that, yes, they agree with the quote and the contrast gives clarity. And that's probably another good way to think about it, right? You not only get clarity, you also earn an appreciation, perhaps, in the way that Abraham was saying, right? You can't maybe know one without knowing the other. Any other thoughts? Anyone else have any strong ideas or maybe an opposition to the quote? Como digo, no hay respuesta correcta ni nada. I'm sure you might already see on the screen kind of where I'm headed with this. I mean, para que vean, right? The for everyone's, I guess, added benefit. Context is everything, right? And I do believe that that's kind of where the quote is going, right? And if we wanted to really understand what context means, we should probably break it down a little bit more. Context can be generally defined as the interrelated conditions in which something exists or occurs. Y el contexto en español se más o menos define como las condiciones interrelacionadas en cual algo existe o ocurre. And I suppose another way to really think about context is to think of it in the things that comprise context. What is context made of? Well, in writing, especially, we would say that context is the setting, el escenario, el ambiente tangible y mensurable en cual algo ocurre. The setting, the environment can include things like the physical location of something, right? That can inform our context. It can even be informed by something like the weather, you know, um, and obviously the time of day, the hour, the day, even the month or year. I mean, if we're talking about the context of uh, our quote was written during the 17th century. That's when Anne Bradstreet lived. So for Anne Bradstreet, given that specific context of the 17th century, por eso va a decir lo que dice y de la manera en que lo dice. You know, this might be rephrased differently if it was maybe the second century or if it was even today, right? The 21st. So that's how we can generally understand context. También son las circunstancias, los elementos coincidentales. The coincidental elements can be things that provide the added context, like the people that are there, the people who are saying these things, or the people who these things are being told. It can also be determined by the interactions that we're having or that we have had. And of course, the emotions, right? Las emociones, sobre todo, yo creo que va a dar un toque especial para el contexto de algo. That's especially going to be true when we kind of get into the mechanics of context in writing. But going back to the quote, now that we talked a little bit about context, if you kind of put yourself in the context of Anne Bradstreet's life, what do you think this came from? Where do you think this quote came from? Ya conociendo el contexto en que Anne Bradstreet escribió esto o dijo esto. Does that add any insights for you? Yeah, Abraham?
Well, since we're talking about context, I tend to listen to a lot of different podcasts. And
Mhm,
before they go into any subject, I noticed that most of them are definitely introducing us to the what's the story behind any particular subject they want to approach.
mhm,
For example, if you're going to talk about like a person who was a woman and has been tried to be a witch, of course, you had to put into context that back in the day, women didn't have as many rights as men do. So they were the more vulnerable people in a community. And
mhm,
here, I think the context for her, it's like in particular in the East Coast, the winters, and especially at that time, they were super harsh, right?
mhm,
And people sometimes even die, I'm assuming. And especially like in colonial times, it's a hard thing to witness or to live through. And then you have to see like, okay, once we make it to the summer or the spring, we're gonna have plenty, we're gonna have more food, we're gonna have more warmth, we're gonna
mhm.
be able to go outside. So definitely it speaks more of the like you can feel more of the writing by having the context.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Sarah on Instagram also would agree, right? This maybe came from her adapting to her new surroundings, and I think it's appropriate for us to look at it from that point of view too, you know. And Bradstreet lived in a time where, as a woman, she did not have equal rights to men, like period. And maybe that might be the same now, you know, for her, depending on where she's from and all of that, but it was definitely a different time with many other challenges that we don't face today. So to invoke the idea of winter and the spring, I think is appropriate given her circumstances in that time period in colonial America. No. So let's continue with the conversation a little bit more. Les quiero presentar antes de que sigamos la autora Liane Ogasawara. Liane Ogasawara has worked as a Japanese translator for 20 years. Her translation work has included academic translation, poetry, philosophy, and documentary film. The essay we're going to read originally appeared in River Teeth's Beautiful Things blog in 2020. Y en español, el ensayo que vamos a leer se llama El inicio de primavera. Fue escrito por Leanne Ogasawara, quien ha trabajado como traductora de japonés por más de 20 años. Sus traducciones han incluido traducciones académicos, poesía, filosofía y film documental. Este ensayo originalmente apareció en el blog de River Teeth llamado Beautiful Things en el año 2020, precisamente durante el inicio de la pandemia, for those that still remember those days. Do I have a volunteer that might want to read this? It's a pretty short little piece of flash creative nonfiction. And I'll kind of explain what creative nonfiction is in a moment, pero do I have a volunteer that would like to read one of them? Is that your hand volunteering, Abraham? No.
I do if the other people don't want to, but I'm gonna let it for them. I'm speaking a lot today.
I can read whichever you prefer.
Well, why don't you kick us off with the English River, and then if there's someone that wants to give it a shot in Spanish, we can give them a chance.
Let me know if my voice is loud enough.
It is. We can hear you.
Beginning of spring. The Chinese calendar had it right, insisting that spring begins in February is to begin a season at the beginning, when the season is only just awakening, a quiet stirring. Spring begins as the east wind melts the ice, when insects begin trembling, quivering, and shivering. In Tokyo, it begins when the nightingales sing Hohokekyo, Hohokekyo, chanting 1,000 times a day like a Buddhist sutra. The beginning of spring is cold. Plum blossoms covered in snow shimmer by moonlight. In Pasadena, it is the bulbuls that sing the beginning of spring, sweetly on cold mornings. Sometimes mornings in February bring the parrots squawking maniacally in the trees, or as they move across the sky in gigantic flocks. At night, peacocks shrieking in the palm trees can be heard for miles. Spring is here! Spring is here! And oh, how charming it is when the dandelions appear in the second month, Lady Say Shanogan might say. Dandelions blanketing my neighbor's lawn, I think, isn't it charming? Then, with the third, fourth, fifth flush of oranges, comes the goldfinches, like fluttering golden chunks of sunshine, little piggies flying. I watch them feasting at the I watch them feasting at the bird feeder out my kitchen window. This is the world awakening. Spring is here. Spring is here.
Thank you, River. Y tengo por ahí un voluntario que me lo puede leer en español. Grisel.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. El inicio de la primavera. El calendario chino lo tuvo correcto. El insistir que la primavera empieza en febrero es comenzar una estación en el inicio, cuando la estación apenas va despertando un movimiento callado. La primavera empieza cuando los vientos orientales derriten el hielo, cuando insectos empiezan a temblar, tiritar, estremecer. Sí. En Tokio empieza cuando los ruiseñores cantan. O-o-ke-kyo, o-o-ke-kyo, cantando 1000 veces al día, como sutra budista. El inicio de primavera es frío. Las flores de los ciruelos cubiertas de nieve brillan a la luz de luna. En Pasadena son los pájaros bulbul que dulcemente cantan el inicio de primavera en las mañanas frías. A veces las mañanas de febrero traen a los pericos, graznando maniáticamente con los árboles o al traspasar el cielo en bandanas gigantescas. En la noche, los pavos reales gritando entre palmeras se escuchan desde a millas de lejos. Llegó la primavera, llegó la primavera. Y, oh, qué encantador es cuando los dientes de león se aparecen en el segundo mes. Podría decir señora Shonagon, dientes de león, cobijando el pasto de mi vecino, pienso. ¿No es encantador? Luego con la tercera, cuarta, quinta forrada de naranjas, vienen los jilgueros, como trozos dorados de sol revoloteando, puerquitos volando, los veo desde la ventana de mi cocina festejando. I can't see the other one. Can you put it up? Okay. Festejando en el comedero para pájaros. Este es el mundo despertando. Llegó la primavera, llegó la primavera.
Excellent. Thank you, Grisel. So, first thoughts. What stood out to you in this extremely short little essay? ¿Qué cosa les llamó la atención? River?
The way, my favorite part is the goldfinches.
Hmm.
The puerquitos, the little piggies flying, the chunks of sunshine. I just thought that was the best.
Yeah, that's a very descriptive line for sure. I like that part too. ¿Alguien más? Abraham?
Yeah, that one made me giggle. And I, the thing I think I appreciate a lot, it's like nowadays with technology and we have all these weather channels or whatever telling us when spring and summer and winter are going to be.
Mhm.
I do appreciate that saying like the things that really mark the seasons are the actual events or the things that are happening that let us know that the winter or the spring is coming. In this way, she's talking about the birds, how they telling us that okay, this new season is coming, right? Or like when old people used to tell you, when I feel this type of cold, it's when this is gonna be the next winter, right? Like these like signals that we get from nature that lets us know like, okay, this big change is coming instead of, oh, this is the day. No, it's not exactly that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think Sarah in our Instagram also picked up on the reference to the parrots squawking, and also writes, it strikes a chord for locals who are attuned to the sound and the stories it brings, the nostalgia. And yeah, if you live in the, Northeast LA area, Pasadena, Altadena, even Highland Park, you definitely understand the reference to the wild parrots. Um, but I agree with you, Abraham. There's something about the natural way in which we experience the coming of spring. And that's what I think is being talked about in this particular piece. Um, Tori wrote in our Zoom chat, I like how it was this bigger idea, a philosophy of springtime, and then it brings it very close to home and relatable when the mention of Pasadena. It went from a philosophy to being a sight just outside my window. The mention of the backyard birds and backyard flowers had me thinking of the times I see spring in LA and the Inland Empire. I started to think of all the memories and images of the plants and animal sights and sounds around, even the smell of citrus. Yeah, for sure. I actually have a few citrus trees in my front yard, and it's definitely the season of harvest for both the lemons and the oranges. And yeah, I like that particular reference. And I love the smell of citrus flowers and jasmine too. This is the way that I know that spring is upon us. In the Instagram chat, we also have what story those parrots are from when space. And everybody has a story, according to Sarah. Yeah, this is absolutely true. You know, that's one of the things that I personally really appreciate about things like memoir and creative nonfiction. If we were to categorize this little essay here, it would be definitely something that is more creative nonfiction. It is based in reality. This is not fake. It is not telling a story that does not uh, exist outside of this person's life. They are speaking from their lived experiences. And what makes it creative is the approach, right? We're using some of the things that we've talked about before, like metaphor, simile. We're using very descriptive writing to tell a story about, in this case, the coming of spring. How many of you in the group here have practiced creative nonfiction before? Uh, the question in the chat is, I should know this, but what by definition is creative nonfiction? What makes it nonfiction from fiction? And River has tried writing creative nonfiction. So fiction by definition is something that is made up, something that is completely false. Uh, it's not something that is going to be, how should I say it? Based in a reality that is a reality that a person has actually lived. Um, you could have things that are like historical fictions, which use elements of history to tell a story about a character that never existed. Nonfiction is the opposite of that, right? So you could have historical nonfiction where it's about a person who lived in a specific historical time period. And that would then be told either as like a biography, It could be autobiographical too. Nonfiction can be writing that you write about yourself. And creative nonfiction, adding that creative element really just means that you're adding in things that you would normally use, techniques and other skill sets that you would normally use in writing poetry or writing, like, say, a short story. There's a lot of that happening here in this particular piece. But ultimately, there's no right or wrong way to approach creative nonfiction. Um, as long as it's telling a story that is based in a reality that you've lived, is the best way that I could, you know, define it for you. Um, thank you for sharing your work there, River, in the chat. Appreciate that. And yeah, Sarah on Instagram has also written creative nonfiction. Yeah, you're welcome for the explanation, Tori. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta about creative nonfiction? La prosa, básicamente. That's another thing too that I should probably mention. It is prose, right? Creative nonfiction is usually written as prose, like we see here, in the form of an essay, as opposed to a poem. Although a poem could, I mean, if it's autobiographical, could be, I guess, creative nonfiction also. So if there's no other questions. So here we have again, right, this piece that tells us the story of the coming of spring. Ya llegó la primavera. Y como ven aquí en este ejemplo, estamos usando varios elementos que vienen de nuestra plática sobre el contexto, right? Context was very important in this specific little essay. The setting was something that was very tangible, right? Where did this story take place? Well, Pasadena, right? And if we look at the weather conditions outside, how do we know what the weather is like? Well, there's a few references up here, no? We know that the time of year is February, right? There's a, you know, spring east wind, right? That's melting ice. We are told in a couple of places that, there's still snow, right? Spring is cold, there is snow. Además, a ver, ¿a dónde más encontramos aquí? Los pericos, las mañanas frías, aquí también, right? So tenemos varios elementos aquí a donde nos está dando contexto para este cuento. There's also other things too. We don't exactly know who Lady Sei Shonagon is, but there is a person, right? And there's clearly some sort of relationship with this person because they are being remembered. We don't need to have that much of an explanation, but it's there. And then there's also a sense of interactions, not maybe with people in this case, but with nature, right? Al fin de este cuentito, la interacción que vemos más, sobre todo, es como los trozos dorados de sol revoloteando llegan pues, a la ventana de la cocina. This final interaction of the goldfinches is what I believe ties in the entire story because we have now the speaker of this little essay giving us a sense of their place within this larger story, right? They're not just observing, they're now actively interacting with everything around them. So these particular techniques, these would be the techniques that you would be looking at using if you were to write a piece of creative nonfiction. These are some of the things that you would want to focus on. Does anyone have any questions so far? Or maybe observations, things that I might have missed within the story that you might see here?
I think like Sarah alluded to the time frame.
Yeah.
We have the where, the environment, and
Mhm.
perhaps sentiments or whatever. But time is an as well thing. For example, William used to have herds back in the day. These birds are kind of new to California.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. The time frame for this, we don't really know if it's modern day, although I think the assumption is that this is modern day. But we for sure know that this is some time period in a contemporary history, right? It could be in the 1960s, it could be 2020. Well, the reason why we know it's 2020 right now in reality is because of the intro, ¿verdad? But sometimes, strong writing can stand on its own that way, right? And we can read it in a way that, pues, es independiente de la época en que se escribió. It's a little tricky sometimes, but it can be done. Now, going back to what Anne Bradstreet was saying, regresando específicamente a esta parte de la cita, si no conociéramos la adversidad, la prosperidad no se recibiría con tanto gusto. If we did not sometimes taste of adversity, prosperity would not be so welcome. We had obviously the first part of the quote here. If we go back up, right? If we had no winter, the spring would not be so pleasant. I think that that's pretty pretty well illustrated in the beginning of spring right here by Ogasawara. Um, but what about this second part now? If we were to look at this and think about, how are we going to talk about adversity and prosperity in our own writing, for example? What is something to consider here about at least this phrase? Well, my argument, and I believe Eric was onto something earlier, he was picking up on it. It's this concept of dualism, right? El dualismo. Y honestamente, casi todas las culturas durante el tiempo del humano han contemplado este concepto, right? Dualism is nothing new. It's been around probably since, human beings started really thinking about their place in the world. Dualism, because of how long it has been around, at least in our thoughts, it has led to people developing different philosophical and spiritual models that reflect on our understanding of what would be called the human condition. And that has a big definition. I'm not really going to go into too much of what the human condition means in terms of a phrase. But basically, when it comes down to it, all the different ways in which cultures have developed their ideas of dualism can be more or less categorized in three different ways. Las tres categorías distintas del dualismo básicamente llegan a ser el dualismo mental corporeal, mind-body dualism, which, as you see here, it's a philosophical view that holds that mental phenomena are, in certain respects, not physical, or that the mind and the body are distinct and separable from one another. En español, el dualismo mental corporeal es un modelo filosófico que sostiene que los fenómenos mentales no son, en ciertos respetos, fenómenos físicos, o que la mente y el cuerpo son distintos y separables de uno al otro. This might sound complicated, but I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase mind over matter, right? In a lot of ways, that's what the mind-body dualism idea is getting at. We can block out pain if we focus within our mind, right? The things that we feel through our senses, our five senses, if we're fortunate enough to have all five, those are things that we can experience independently of our mind. And that right there is, I mean, that's up for debate, that might be something that you could train to ultimately accomplish. But this is about your perception of the world through your physical body and your mind, right? Does anyone have any questions about this one? El dualismo mental corporeal. Como digo, ese quizá más o menos lo entiendan. No es algo que sea muy, hay que decir, extraño para la mayoría de gente, especialmente si has visto muchas películas de Kung Fu. The next one, this one can be maybe a little bit trickier for people to get, but it's the concept of property dualism, which is a view that is both the philosophy of mind and metaphysics. And this one, it admits or it acknowledges that the world is composed of one kind of substance, the physical kind, right? That there is matter that comprises everything that we can experience in this world. However, there also exist two distinct kinds of properties or states of beings, right? There's the physical property and the mental property. Let me read it in Spanish first. Y para ustedes que son bilingües, quizá lo entiendan un poquito mejor en español, porque el dualismo propietario es un modelo de la filosofía mental y metafísica, cual sostiene que a pesar de que el mundo está compuesto de un solo tipo de materia, la materia física, existen dos distintos tipos de propiedades, las propiedades físicas y propiedades mentales. In some ways, property dualism is about the argument of consciousness. We can experience things in a physical sense, right? We can go around and, place our fingers, our hands on objects that exist in a world, and they are manifested out of some form of matter. However, there is also a metaphysical world that exists only in our minds, right? How does the phrase go en español? Cada cabeza su propio mundo. Básicamente, eso es lo que quiere decir el dualismo propietario. Las propiedades mentales solo existen en nuestra mente. The mind, the consciousness, the thoughts that we have can only exist in our mind because they can never fully be put to form. We can write about them, but they'll never be exactly the same as they appear in our minds. Um, River writes in the chat, this is too big for my brain. I'll be thinking about this for a while. Es más que mi mente puede comprender. Voy a pensar de estos conceptos por semanas. Yeah, these are kind of big philosophical discussions. But ultimately, mind-body dualism, going back to sort of the basic, is the ability to control our bodies through, detachment. Property dualism is about the existence of things either in a physical or a metaphysical sense. There is only one or the other way for things to exist, either in the real world or in an imaginary or maybe metaphysical world, a world that is intangible, right? Does anyone have any questions or want me to maybe better explain the first two? Si más o menos me van entendiendo.
I think both kind of similar in a way. I think the only one that feels a little like the difference I could perceive is one has to do with more breaking down the body, the mind and the body, and the other one's beyond the body and the mind, like the outside world. Like, okay, I perceive this car because I'm looking at it, my brain is thinking about it, but it's just a little thing moving in the context of physics. Right. And my brain is telling me it's an Audi, it costs this much. I should avoid it. I don't want to crash it because it's so expensive. So that could be the differences, right? Where mind's trying to tell us what it is, what in reality is, right?
Yeah, that's one way to think about it, Abraham. Mind body is about exactly like you said, the way that our say souls might interact with our mind and our consciousness and our physical body, right? So this is about the personal. Property dualism is about bigger things, right? The existence of things. Things can exist either in the real world, like the Audi that you're saying, or they can exist in our mind as what we picture an Audi to be, right?
Or
That's
like the stocks, if you think about it.
yeah,
Stocks, in the economical sense, they exist, right?
yeah,
But in the physical world, they might not.
yeah, exactly. It could be like crypto, right? Cryptocurrency. It exists in some sort of world in a metaphysical way, but in the real world, cryptocurrency does not exist. Only dollar bills, only pesos, only whatever currency
Yeah.
we can physically hold, right? That's what property dualism is about. The one that I think most people will have maybe the least trouble understanding is the cosmological dualism. This one is one that I think informs a lot of people's behavior. El dualismo cosmológico es un modelo teológico o espiritual que dicta que solo existen dos conceptos fundamentales, tal como lo bueno y lo malo. Y estos dos conceptos son de cada manera opuestos de uno al otro. Like I said, cosmological dualism is probably the one that people understand the easiest because it usually dictates the way that people treat each other or the way we might treat ourselves. It's a theological fundamental concepts such as good and evil, and that these two concepts are in every way opposed to one another. All of these ideas of dualism all require an understanding of context, right? These will change based on who we are, what the time period is in history, even the people that we're interacting with. All of these things exist with context. The context is very important. Like I wrote right here, good cannot exist without evil, right? That's part of the context, that dichotomy, that duality. Prosperity cannot exist without poverty, and we cannot rebuild or build without first destroying. Um, let's see, what did Sarah say here in the chat? Or Pizza Hut to a certain generation, it's a sit-down restaurant. Right? That's very true. To a certain generation, to those of us that are old enough to remember, Pizza Hut was once a sit-down restaurant, right? A
Quick
dine-in.
question. Is Pizza Hut still standing? I haven't seen one in a while.
Pizza Hut as a delivery still exists.
Oh,
The sit-down restaurants that were
oh,
Pizza
they're
Hut,
gone?
uh, I believe there's very, very few. They might still be around, pero ya casi no existen.
Damn.
I also like your comparison there, Abraham, in the chat. Winter could be bad and spring could be the good, or the
I
other
mean,
way around, as Grisel
yeah,
says, right?
it's more on the context of the um, quote that we had.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely depending on context. And looks like River still has a sit-down Pizza Hut near them. They raised all the sit-down ones and collapsed them to pickups. Yeah, that's generally what happened with most Pizza Huts. But yeah, there's very, very few left. Which I guess goes to what I was saying here in this last one, right? We cannot build or rebuild without destroying. Y como pues el tema de esta serie es reconstrucción. Es obvio que al último iba a llegar a esta conclusión, ¿no? Que tenemos que destruir para luego reconstruir. So, with that in mind, I'd like y'all to think about a time when you had to lose something in order to gain something. Tomen un momento, no tiene que ser un momento muy, hay que decir, muy pesado, ¿verdad? Am, pero con todo lo que hemos hablado en mente, piensen sobre un momento en que tuviste que perder algo para ganar algo. All of us have gone through this. Like, there's no one that has, in my opinion, been able to escape this almost part of living, you know. And as you think about this moment, begin taking notes in your mind, or better yet, write them down, right? Make note of the contextual elements to your story, right? What was the location where this thing happened, where you had to lose whatever it was that you lost in order to gain something more? What was the time of day when that moment occurred? What was the weather like? Who else was there? And if there was somebody else there, how did you interact with them? And if it's relevant, what emotions manifested? Maybe it wasn't you that became emotional. Maybe it was someone else who had emotions come up for them. Pero tomen un momento y, como dije, de preferencia, escriban sus notas sobre la localidad, la hora del día en que este momento ocurrió, cuál fue el tiempo, cuál fue el clima, quién estuvo ahí con ustedes. Y si alguien estaba allí, ¿cómo se relacionaron entre ustedes? ¿Cómo fueron las interacciones entre ustedes? Y si fue un momento emotivo, ¿cuáles emociones se manifestaron? Like I said, this doesn't have to be like, say, an overly traumatic moment. You know, if it feels difficult to write about a moment that really did change your life in that way, you can maybe even think about, I don't know, a moment where you realized that winter was gone and now spring arrived. But think about a moment where you had to lose something in order to gain something, en que algo se tuvo que destruir para luego reconstruir. Y les voy a dar como unos, hay que decir, 5 minutos. For the next 5 minutes, I encourage you to reflect on these moments, reflect on the things that we see here. And if you feel comfortable, you can share the notes. It doesn't have to be the full story, right? But you can share some of the notes in the chat. I think I can actually share the music while I have the handout on the screen, but well, either way, YouTube would probably pause our live stream.
For me, this kind of exercise reminds me of this
Mhm,
song that I like. It's basically about this couple who are going through hard times,
mhm,
and even they mentioned them like having to be in the like unemployment line and
mhm,
drinking cheap wine by themselves, because they have nothing to do and no TV, whatever, cable, I guess. And by doing so, they're losing so much, but it's still just because they're now hanging out together because there's nothing else to do, like job or something else. They
mhm.
end up manage to finding like meeting themselves almost like the first time again. You just know you get into that kind of space. So I'll share the song on the chat. So check
Cool.
it out.
Yeah,
Which
sounds good. Ya, para que vean, pues, siempre hay diferentes maneras en que uno puede, pues, vivir estos cambios, ¿no?
Yeah,
O-
sometimes in hardship you can find
Yeah,
good things, In this
yeah,
case, they kind
absolutely.
of find that they're they're meeting themselves again because
Yeah,
sometimes we lose ourselves in like jobs or other things, and I don't know, sometimes we need that space even if it's in hardship.
yeah, yeah. And thank you for sharing your short little story there, Grisel, in the chat. It was one winter night. I had to move in with my new family and leave the one I grew up with behind. Yeah, I think that that can definitely be one of those moments where you might feel like you're losing something, but you're also gaining something in return. So thank you for sharing that. Winning new fam. Yeah, exactly. You win a new family. Definitely. Well, I'm glad you feel that way, Grisel. Again, context, right? The context matters. Trying to think of a specific moment for myself, and it's actually kind of hard to think about it off the top of your head. So I can sympathize with you if you're having trouble right now. I can give you at least a kind of funny one. For most of my life, I didn't really care too much for seafood outside of maybe sushi and fish tacos. So when I started eating shrimp, for the very first time, I had the very tiny little shrimps, the little empanizados, ¿verdad? Camarón empanizado. And I liked it. But the first time that I realized that I was actually allergic to shrimp, it was when I was actually hospitalized because I was suffering severe stomach pain. And they gave me this whole like test of allergens, and I discovered then that I was allergic to shrimp. And I thought, that can't be real. I had eaten shrimp before, there was never any real problems with me eating shrimp. But when I got out of the hospital, and this was at an old job where I used to coordinate an after school program, the parents saw me and they were like, man, has perdido un montón de peso. Vamos a traerte algo de comer. Yeah, Ivan, everyone all happy and just very nice with me, bringing me food. And one lady brought me un paella con camarón. And man, I really enjoyed that paella. But I took a bite of one of the pieces of shrimp that was in there because I was like, I can't, I must be okay. They must have gotten something wrong at the doctor's. And after taking that very first bite, I can remember very clearly. It was kind of chilly in the after school programs building. All of us were, I think this was, I want to say like around August. So, all of us were feeling pretty cold because we had the air conditioning up pretty high. And the paella had already gotten kind of cold because of how cold we had the AC blasting. And I took a bite of that shrimp and I remember the feeling of it. It was a little bit cold in my mouth. And as soon as I bit into it and I started chewing and I swallowed, I immediately started to feel the tightness in my throat. And I started to have to go repeatedly where I was trying to clear my throat. And that's when I realized that I couldn't have shrimp anymore. But that said, I was at least able to continue enjoying the rest of the food that they were bringing me. And that was the very first time that I was introduced to a homemade pambazo. So I lost one thing, but gained a full appreciation for another.
If it makes you feel better, that shrimp was allergic to you too. It died.
True story. That makes me feel a lot better, Abraham. Thank you. Yeah, it was a bad feeling. I definitely did not enjoy that river, but like I said, context, the story could have ended pretty bad, but I chose to look at it in a positive way, right?
Pambazos are bomb.
Bombazos, for those that do not know, you need to go out and find one because they are the bomb.
It's like a drowned torta, if you think about it.
Kind of like a
Um,
torta ahogada, but
mhm.
not in the style of Jalisco. Like this is a Mexico City specific thing. So yeah.
I hear that also people who are allergic to shrimp
Mhm.
can be allergic to other type of not crustaceans, but like animals that are like it,
Yeah.
like roaches or things like that.
Yeah.
Just because I don't know, the body thinks it's the same thing, I guess.
Yeah, there are other things that yeah, they could be similar. There's a good recipe for one in the Chicano Eats book. Thank you, Sarah. I believe that's a recipe for a pambazo. So
That
anybody's
means she's
curious,
making it.
right?
Nice.
All right. So the 5 minutes are up. I hope all of you had a moment to at least begin taking notes to whatever that moment was where things were maybe an opportunity to rebuild for you or to start anew. And of course, su tarea esta semana es to, in 300 words or less, tell your story of change, tell your story of new beginnings. En 300 palabras o menos, cuenta tu cuento de cambio, de nuevos inicios. Obviously, I recommend that you use the notes that you started doing now, right? That you started taking now for your time that you're thinking about writing. Todas estas notas, todos estos elementos de contexto van a servir para ustedes al escribir su cuentito. And again, 300 words or less. And for context, this piece that we read today, este ensayo que vino de Osagawara, fue menos de 210 palabras. So this right here, well, maybe not in the Spanish, but in the English, it is just under 210 words. So it's very possible to write a full story about a moment in 300 words or less. So does anyone have any questions or anything they'd like to share? You're definitely welcome to share now. Does anyone want me to explain dualism a little bit more? Not to overwhelm or nothing, but no. There was a time when you started counting from 1 to 300.
There you go. The end.
Boom. All right. Well, for those of you here on Zoom, I have copy and pasted your homework in the chat. Así que ahí lo tienen también. For those of you joining in on the live streams, you should be able to see it on the screen there if you'd like to join in. Next week, for everyone, we will have our workshopping session and followed by a second workshopping session. So the next 2 weeks are a perfect opportunity for you to work on your 300 word or less creative nonfiction piece about your moment where you had to lose something in order to gain something. Y pues recomiendo que aprovechen de esos días, porque vamos a darles notas, van a ser oportunidades para que puedan hasta escribir, si es que necesitan el tiempo para escribir un poco. We'll give you the space and the time to do a little bit of writing if you feel like you need it during the workshopping sessions for the next 2 weeks. As a reminder, also, for those of you that are considering submitting to the Conchas y Café zine, we will be actually this year combining issue number 1 with issue number 2 to make a larger 10-year special. This is the 10th year, believe it or not, of Conchas y Café existing and publishing the work of our local authors. So, felicidades para ustedes que han sido publicados anteriormente. I think that it's, a big milestone for us as an organization, 10 years of offering Conchas y Café to the community. So if you'd like to get in on this action and be featured in the special 10-year issue, I recommend you go to our website, distillarts.org/Conchas y Café zine. You can find the link for submitting your work. Again, the theme for this particular time, for this particular series is rebuild or rebuilding. El reconstruir es el tema de este 10º aniversario especial. Y yeah, I hope that y'all submit work before our last day, which is May 13th, el 13 de mayo. Ese va a ser el último día para entregar obras poéticas, obras creativas a este venidero zine. So thank you everyone for joining in. I'll stay on for a few more minutes for those of you on Zoom if you have any questions. But I really am looking forward to reading your stories this upcoming week. So hasta pronto, gente. Peace.